Daniel Lucas,
And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
and welcome to Love Letters. Love Letters are a collection of love stories of people get lost, get crazy, and disoriented in the name of love. Another week, another great episode. When wisdom meets the strife, love in the time of apocalypse.
This is how the dating scene became apocalyptic, and it's a wild world out there. And that's the thesis of an article that's reacting to today from the Daily Wire shop. Here we're offering an exploration of modern dating through the lens of historical and contemporary wisdom. And we're reacting to a piece about modern dating that caught our attention. This idea that reached some kind of peak feminism where traditional relationship formation has become nearly impossible. The article describes women choosing dog shelters over marriage, rejecting men who want white picket fences, and demanding absolute perfection in partners.
In partners, indeed. So, Mr. Mick, is it unprecedented in human history?
Yes, we have the collision of ancient human longings with hyper-modern choice architecture. What struck me most wasn't necessarily the characterization of feminism, but rather what psychologist Barry Schwartz calls the paradox of choice, playing out in the most intimate area of human life. But let's start with some honest feminist scholarship here. Camille Paglia, who's hardly anti feminist, has written extensively about how contemporary feminism sometimes fails young people by not acknowledging biological and psychological realities. In Free Women, Free Men, she argues that feminism has become too narrow and at the same time too preachy, and that modern feminist ideology often ignores how men and women might naturally complement each other in relationships. She writes, I want young women to see that you can be a feminist and recognize that men and women are different, that gender is not just a social construct. Similarly, Christina Hoff Sommers in Who Stole Feminism distinguishes between what she calls equity feminism, seeking fair treatment, and gender feminism, the ideology that views traditional gender roles as inherently oppressive. She documents how this latter form has created what she terms a climate of resentment that makes healthy male female relationships increasingly difficult. The early church father John Chrysostom, writing in the 4th century, actually championed women's intellectual equality while recognizing complementary roles. In his On Marriage and Family Life, he writes, the woman is a second authority, having indeed authority and considerable equality of honor, but at the same time, the man has precedence over her as the head. But notice what he says next. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife has not power of her own body, but the husband, and likewise also husband has not power of his own body, but the wife. In conclusion, we're dealing with ancient questions about how equality and complementarity can exist in relationships, but modern ideology often forces us to choose between them rather than integrate them.
How do we understand this historically, Mr. Mick?
What we're witnessing today has remarkable parallels to the late Roman Empire, particularly in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in his Germania around 98 AD, contrasts the declining marriage culture of Rome with the Germanic tribes. Almost alone among barbarians, they are content with one wife, except a very few among them, and these not from sensuality, but because their noble birth procures for them many offers of alliance. By the time of Augustus, Roman elites were increasingly choosing to remain single or childless. The historian Dio Cassius records Augustus addressing the Roman knights in 9 AD, saying, what is the use of laws without marriages? What is the use of marriages without children? Augustine had to pass laws in 18 BC and later another one in 9 AD, essentially laws to incentivize marriage and penalize childlessness because Romans were abandoning family formation entirely. The philosopher Seneca, writing around 65 AD, captures the elite Roman attitude. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. But this philosophical detachment masked what the early Christians recognized as spiritual and social decay. The historian Jerome, writing in the late 4th century, describes Roman women of his era. They divorce in order to remarry, they marry in order to divorce, they flee from fertility as from a plague. What's striking is how the early Christians responded to this cultural moment. They didn't retreat into puritanical isolation, but rather offered a compelling alternative vision. Take Augustine's On the Good of Marriage from around 401 AD. He writes, "Marriage is good, but a greater good is virginity, yet a married woman may be holier than a virgin." But here's the key. He's not dismissing marriage. He's placing it within a hierarchy of goods where committed partnership serves both personal flourishing and social stability. But let's look at an even earlier source. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD in his Stramata, he directly addresses the cultural libertinism of his era. Some people think that marriage is fornication and teach that it was instituted by the devil. These arrogant people want to be like God. But these people will have to give an account to God for their blasphemy. Clement is defending marriage against both libertine culture and extreme asceticism. The apostolic constitutions, compiled in the 4th century, give us insight into early Christian courtship practices. When anyone desires to marry, let him give his name to the bishop, and let the bishop inquire concerning him, whether he be temperate, whether he be given to drunkenness, whether he be quarrelsome, whether he be a railer, whether he be have a concubine. This wasn't an arranged marriage, but it was a community guided partner evaluation based on character rather than mere attraction. The Talmudic tractate in about the same time provides even deeper insight. When husband and wife are worthy, the divine presence rests between them. When they are not worthy, fire consumes them. The Hebrew word for man, ish, contained the letter yud, and the woman word for woman, isha, retains the latter hey. Together they spell out one of the names of God. Remove these letters and you're left with Esh, fire. The teaching is that godly marriage creates divine presence, but marriage without a spiritual foundation becomes destructive. Contemporary psychologist John Gottman's research on successful marriages actually validates these ancient insights. His longitudinal studies of over 3,000 couples show that marriages where both partners feel honored and respected, not identical, but valued for their unique contributions, have significantly higher satisfaction and longevity rates. His four horsemen predict divorce, contempt, criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling are essentially modern descriptions of what the early Christians called spiritual vices that destroy relationships. In conclusion, both ancient wisdom and modern research point toward complementary partnership and community supported commitment rather than either patriarchal dominance or hyper individualized mate selection.
Mr. Mick, what do serious feminist scholars actually say about its effects on relationships and human flourishing?
Some of the most penetrating critiques of the sexual revolution's effects come from feminist scholars themselves. Let's start with Camille Paglia's analysis in Sexual Personae. She writes, "The sexual revolution of the 60s was a brief, reckless gesture that undid centuries of accumulated wisdom about the sexes. In the rush to abolish restrictions, we also abolished protections." Paglia continues, "Feminism has been naive about men. It has not been understood that men at their best are inspired by the vision of women as the repository of beauty, mystery, and power. Strip away that mystery through casual sex and pornography, and you get the ugly contemporary landscape of sexual harassment and date rape. This isn't conservatism. This is a feminist recognizing that sexual liberation without corresponding moral and spiritual development creates new forms of exploitation." Louise Perry, in her recent book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, provides even more devastating analysis. Perry, who considers herself a feminist, argues that the sexual revolution has not liberated women. It has liberated male sexuality at women's expense. She documents how hookup culture systemically advantages men who seek casual encounters while leaving women who are more likely to develop emotional attachments vulnerable to exploitation. Perry writes, "The idea that we can have sex like a man, that is, without emotional consequence, is not realistic for most women." She's drawing on extensive research showing that women produce more oxytocin during sexual activity, creating stronger emotional bonds that casual sexual culture systemically exploits. Jennifer Robach Morse in Smart Sex provides additional feminist analysis. The sexual revolution promised that we could have sex without consequences, but there are always consequences: emotional, physical, and spiritual. The promise of consequence free sex is the promise that can have our cake and eat it too. This is simply not reality. Helen Alver, law professor and feminist scholar, documents how the sexual revolution intersected with economic pressures to create what she calls a perfect storm for women. In Breaking Through, Catholic Women Speak for Themselves, she writes, women were told that they could have careers in consequence free sex, but what they got was pressure to compete sexually with other women while also competing professionally with men, all while bearing the primary burden of unexpected pregnancies and emotional attachments. Contemporary neuroscience Dr. Anna Lebke's research in Dopamine Nation demonstrates how sexual behaviors outside committed relationships literally rewire the brain's reward systems. She writes, the modern world has created unprecedented access to high dopamine substances and experiences, including sexual stimulation through pornography and casual encounters. The result is that many people's brains have become adapted to these high levels of stimulation, making genuine intimacy and commitment more difficult to achieve. Psychologist Dr. Helen Fisher's brain imaging studies show that casual sexual encounters activate different neural pathways than committed intimate relationships. Her research demonstrates that hookup culture literally changes brain chemistry in ways that make pair bonding more difficult. Dr. Leonard Sachs in Girls on the Edge documents how sexual liberation has particularly harmed young women's psychological development. His research shows that girls who engage in casual sexual behavior during adolescence and early adulthood show higher rates of depression, anxiety, and what he terms emotional dysregulation compared to their peers who delay sexual activity or engage in it only within committed relationships. This connects directly to what the early Christians understood about the relationship between sexual ethics and social stability. John Chrysostom writes in his homilies on Matthew, nothing is more worthless than a human being who lives only for pleasure. Such a person is lower than the beasts because even they know seasons and limits. He's not being prudish. He's recognizing that humans, unlike animals, need moral and spiritual frameworks to channel sexual desire constructively. In conclusion, feminist scholars, early Christian writers, Jewish wisdom, and contemporary psychological research converge on a striking insight. Sexual liberation without corresponding moral and spiritual development doesn't actually liberate anyone. It creates new forms of exploitation and emotional dysfunction that particularly harm women and undermine the possibility of deep, committed relationships.
Deep committed relationship for sure. So, how do you address masculine identity in a way that both faithful in historical wisdom and relevant to contemporary realities, Mr. Mike?
This is perhaps the most important question we're not talking about enough because the crisis of masculine identity is creating a feedback loop that makes healthy relationships increasingly difficult for everyone. And again, some of the most insightful analysis comes from unexpected sources. Camille Paglia in Free Women, Free Men writes, masculinity is aggressive, unstable, combustible. It is also the most creative cultural force in history. Women must recognize that the masculine principle, at its best, is visionary and transformative. But she continues, contemporary feminism has failed to understand that when you attempt to eliminate traditional masculine roles without providing alternative channels for masculine energy, you don't get sensitive men, you get confused, resentful, and often destructive men. Warren Farrell, author of The Boy Crisis, provides extensive research showing that boys and young men in contemporary culture are struggling academically, professionally, and emotionally at unprecedented rates. He writes, for the first time in American history, our sons will have less education, earn less money, and live shorter lives than their fathers. Jordan Peterson, in 12 Rules for Life, draws heavily on both psychological research and mythological wisdom to argue that men need to develop what he calls hierarchies of competence, structures that allow them to develop skills, take responsibility, and contribute meaningfully to their communities. The early Christian tradition taught about masculinity, and it's far more nuanced than either feminist caricatures or contemporary manosphere ideology suggests. John Chrysostom, in his Instructions to Catechumens, writes about Christian masculinity as fundamentally oriented towards service and sacrifice. He says, "The man who loves his wife shows patience and kindness, not for any reward, but out of concern for her." But notice what comes next. Let the husband be ready to die for his wife. This is the husband's love. This is the husband's wisdom, to consider his wife's honor more precious than his own life. Augustine, in his On the Good of Marriage, provides even deeper psychological insight. He writes, "The male finds his completion not in ruling over the female, but in joining with her in mutual submission to God and mutual service to each other and their children." Augustine is describing what modern psychology calls secure attachment, the ability to both be strong and vulnerable, both protective and receptive. This is masculine willingness to sacrifice combined with spiritual tenderness as exemplified by the early Christian martyrs. The Desert Fathers provide additional models. Anthony of Egypt, often called the father of monasticism, was described by his contemporary biographer Athanasius as having both the courage of a lion and the gentleness of a dove. These men chose voluntary hardship not to prove their toughness, but to develop what they called apatheia, emotional stability and spiritual strength that could serve others. But perhaps the most profound model of masculinity in Christian and Jewish tradition is King David in the Psalms. David is simultaneously the warrior king who defeats Goliath and the sensitive poet who writes, "Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you." In Psalm 51, after his adultery with Bathsheba, David demonstrates what healthy masculinity does when it fails. "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put me anew and a right spirit within me." This is masculinity that can be both fierce in defense of others and humble in confession of sin. Contemporary research validates these ancient insights about healthy masculinity. Psychologist William Pollack's work on men and emotional development shows that men often struggle in modern relationships because they've been taught to suppress rather than integrate their emotional and protective instincts. His research demonstrates that men who can express both strength and vulnerability have more satisfying relationships and better mental health. Dr. Terrence Real, in I Don't Want to Talk About It, documents how traditional masculine socialization often creates what he calls covert depression in men, emotional numbness masked by workaholism, anger, or addiction. But his research also shows that men who learn to integrate what he calls healthy masculinity, the ability to be both strong and emotional available, become better partners, fathers, and leaders. But here's what's fascinating. When researchers study the most successful contemporary men in relationships, careers, and community leadership, they exhibit characteristics remarkably similar to those described in early Christian literature. Dr. John Gottman's research on successful husbands shows that they are characterized by what he calls emotional intelligence, the ability to be both strong and tender, both protective and vulnerable. This is what contemporary psychology calls servant leadership, influence based on moral authority and genuine care for others' welfare rather than coercive power. In conclusion, authentic masculinity isn't about controlling others or proving dominance. It's about having enough inner strength and emotional security to serve, protect, and when necessary, lead through moral example and sacrificial love. Qualities that both ancient wisdom and modern psychology recognize as essential for healthy relationships and stable communities.
Mr. Mick, what practical guidance can we offer to people trying to navigate modern dating?
All this theory means nothing if it doesn't help actual people navigate the complexities of modern relationship formation. Let's start with what the wisdom traditions actually taught about courtship and partner selection, then translate that to contemporary dating culture. The Talmudic tractate Codicum provides even more specific guidance. Who is fit to marry? One who is God fearing, modest, performs acts of loving kindness, has an occupation, and supports Torah study. Notice the priorities. Character comes before career, spiritual maturity before financial success, generosity before personal achievement. The early Christians took this intentional approach even further. John Chrysostom's Instructions to Young Men on Choosing a Wife provides remarkably specific guidance that sounds surprisingly contemporary. He writes, "Choose a wife not for her beauty, but for her character, not for her wealth, but for her virtue, not for her family connections, but for her fear of God." But Chrysostom doesn't stop there. He continues, "Observe how she treats her parents, how she speaks to servants, how she responds to disappointment. These will tell you more about your future marriage than any amount of romantic conversation." This is what modern psychology calls emotional intelligence assessment, evaluating someone's character through their relationships and reactions to stress. Augustine provides even deeper psychological insight in his soliloquies. He writes, "Before you can truly love another person, you must know yourself in relationship to God, to your community, and to your own deepest desires and fears." This is what contemporary psychology calls differentiation, the ability to maintain your own identity and values within intimate relationships. The early Christians practiced what we might now call contemplative dating, taking time to pray, reflect, and seek wise counsel before romantic making commitments. The apostolic constitutions, compiled in the fourth century, give us specific insight into early Christian courtship practices. When anyone desires to marry, let him name to the bishop, let the bishop inquire concerning him, whether he be temperate, whether he's drunkenness, quarrelsome, railer, concubine, be faithful in what is entrusted to him. Augustine suggests addressing your own emotional wounds, spiritual emptiness, and character defects before expecting another person to complete you. Modern attachment research validates this ancient wisdom. Dr. Sue Johnson, developer of emotionally focused therapy, writes, "The most important thing you can bring to a relationship is your own emotional security. People who are secure in themselves create secure relationships." Her research shows that individuals who have done their emotional and spiritual work are significantly more likely to form stable, satisfying partnerships. Second, prioritize character over chemistry in early dating. Dr. John Gottman's research on relationship success validates this ancient insight. His studies show that couples who build friendship and respect before passion have significantly more stable and satisfying marriages. Third, involve the community in your relationship discernment. The early Christian practice of seeking counsel from mature believers translates to contemporary dating as involving trusted friends, family members, and mentors in evaluating potential partners. This doesn't mean having others choose for you, but recognizing that people in love often have impaired judgment. Fourth, understand that commitment creates intimacy, not the reverse. The Jewish concept of Kedushin literally means sanctification, the idea that marriage creates a sacred space where two people can become fully themselves through mutual service and support. Fifth, practice what the early Christians called custody of the eyes and custody of the heart. Jerome, in his letter to Eustochium, writes, "The soul that is wedded to Christ cannot think of an earthly spouse." While those written for those choosing celibacy, the principle applies to dating, maintaining emotional and physical boundaries that allow clear discernment rather than clouded judgment. Six, develop what Evagrius called patient endurance in the courtship process. The Desert Fathers understood that spiritual growth requires time and often involves temporary discomfort. Applied to dating, this means resisting contemporary culture's demand for immediate gratification and instant clarity about relationship potential. Seventh, practice what Augustine called ordered love, loving people and things according to their proper priority. In his On Christian Doctrine, Augustine writes, "All human love should be ordered toward the love of God, and all earthly relationships should serve eternal purposes." This means viewing potential partners not as objects for personal fulfillment, but as fellow human beings with their own dignity and calling. Finally, understood courtship as a spiritual discipline, not just romantic recreation. The early Christians viewed all of life, including relationships, as opportunities for spiritual growth and service to God and community. Clement of Alexandria writes in his Instructor, "The goal of human life is not happiness, but holiness, and holiness often comes through the challenges and joys of committed relationship." In conclusion, the ancient wisdom, tradition patterns, and contemporary psychological research converge on a clear pattern: intentional, Character based, community supported, spiritually grounded courtship leads to a more stable and satisfying relationship than contemporary culture's emphasis on individual fulfillment, immediate chemistry, and autonomous decision making.
So, Mr. Mick, how do we move beyond the culture war framing to offer something genuinely constructive for people seeking lasting love in our current cultural moment?
I think a culture war framing often obscures the deeper longings that both men and women are expressing. What we're really dealing with isn't a battle between feminism and traditionalism, but a crisis of meaning and purpose in relationships that requires integration rather than reaction. The early church father Gregory of Nazianzus, writing in the 4th century, offered what I think is a profound insight that transcends our contemporary ideological categories. In his oration on holy matrimony, he writes, "Marriage is not a constraint, but a liberation, not a diminishment, but an amplification of human dignity for both husband and wife." This is neither patriarchal nor feminist in contemporary terms. It's something deeper and more holistic. Contemporary feminist scholar Helen Alver, in her research on women and marriage, argues that many women today feel caught between cultural messages that present traditional marriage as oppressive and their own deep desires for committed partnership and family. She writes, "Women want both equality and the opportunity to form families that honor their full humanity." This isn't contradictory, it's human. The problem is ideological frameworks that force us to choose between individual fulfillment and relational commitment. Similarly, Farrell documents in The Boy Crisis how many young men feel caught between traditional masculine expectations and contemporary demands for emotional sensitivity. He writes, "Men want both the opportunity to provide and to protect, and the permission to be vulnerable and nurturing. These aren't contradictory impulses, they're complementary aspects of mature masculinity." The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber's concept of I and thou offers a framework that transcends both traditional patriarchy and contemporary individualism. Buber writes in I and thou, "The primary word I, thou can only be spoken with the whole being. Concentration and fusion into the whole being can never take place through my agency, nor can it ever take place without me. I become through my relation to the thou. As I become I say thou." Philosophical insight translates directly to relationships. Authentic partnership involves two complete persons choosing to create something together that neither could achieve alone, without either person losing their individual dignity or calling. This transcends the false choice between merger and autonomy that plagues contemporary relationship discourse. The early Christians understood this integration perfectly. And in Ephesians 5, Paul writes, "Husband, loves your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church." But notice what comes before this passage. Verse 21 says, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." The famous wives submit to their husbands passage is actually preceded by mutual submission. Paul is describing a relationship where both partners exercise autonomy and both partners practice submission, depending on their particular gifts and the situation's demands. The ancient Christian insight anticipates what contemporary psychology calls differentiated leadership in relationships, the ability to take responsibility and make decisions when necessary, while also being responsive to one partner's needs and perspective. This would take both individual calling and mutual commitment. Integrated relationship formation involves what we might call collaborative courtship, dating that involves both individual discernment and community wisdom. And it's practiced what early Christians called ordered love, loving people and things according to their proper priority. Integrated relationship formation embraces what the Jewish tradition calls repairing or perfecting the world. And it's the practice of what the Desert Fathers called patience, endurance, and relationship development. Integrated relationship formations would understand marriage at what Augustine called a school for holiness, a context for spiritual and character development that serves both individual maturation and social stability. This perspective relationship difficulties from signs of failure into opportunities for growth and provides a framework for persevering through challenge that contemporary soulmate ideology often interprets as evidence of fundamental incompatibility. In conclusion, what we need isn't reaction against feminism or nostalgia for traditional patriarchy, but integration, relationships that honor both equality and complementarity, both individual fulfillment and mutual service, both personal autonomy and chosen interdependence. The wisdom traditions, properly understood, point toward this integration rather than backward to male dominance or forward to complete gender neutrality.
Mr. Mega, very well said. Very well said, Mr. Meg. And in this course aftermath of a collapse where traditional communities have crumbled to dust, a new desperate form of connection emerged. Love in the time of apocalypse, curated on cracked screen and glows against the perpetual twilight. Mr. Meg, would you like to plug in something?
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn, GMIC, the Doctor of Digital Smith, PhD. Listen to the Doctor of Digital podcast. Pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon, Burning America and On Track Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Meg, the Doctor Digital itself, because if you support him, more empowering episodes of the podcast itself, more and more empowering others to come. And please do listen to our latest episode of our baby podcast, Mental Health 101. Mental Health 101 is created to empower our mental health awareness. So, Mr. Mike, thank you so much for your time.
Until next time, Deus Volt.
More to come, people. See you soon.